All right, we better get started. I'm Michael Kenstowitz, the moderator for this session. So this is the Endangered Language session. So this order of speakers today will be Norvin Richards and Jessica Coon and Seth Cable. The format again is each person will speak for 20 minutes, and at the end of the last presentation, we'll have then, 25 minutes for free discussion and comments and questions from the audience. Okay.
So good morning, everybody, and thanks for showing up early in the morning. I appreciate it. So I was asked to talk today about what understudied languages can teach us about syntax. And there's a very simple answer to that question, which is that it's not possible to describe in 20 minutes what understudied languages can teach us about syntax. So I'm done, and I'll take questions now. I was inspired in preparing this talk by random pieces of slander that you standardly find on the internet about, well, what all of us are doing here. I've carefully anonymized these, though I'm sure if you use Google, you can figure out who wrote these things. So the first one is a response to one of these terrible papers that came out recently showing that, I think this one was about the head direction parameter and how it's not strict. This person says, oh, good, it's a poke in the eye for Chomsky and his stupid theory of universals, which implies that there's no need studying any language other than English because they're all the same. Similar sentiment in the second carefully anonymized quote, all of us only speak English or okay, maybe French, and that's why our theories of UG are so terrible. I don't know about you guys, but this kind of talk drives me nuts. I mean, there might have been a time, back when Noam was busy smiting the Bloomfieldians, that this was a place where you could come and be safe from having to think about funny languages, but it hasn't been that way for a very long time. Certainly well before my time, I think at least partly thanks to Ken Hale, this became a place where it was very much important to think about data from languages other than the standard Indo-European ones. It also became the kind of place where we have a tradition of training people who come from communities where indigenous languages are spoken. That's training them in linguistics and helping them to check their theory against viruses. So that's it. That's training right there. If there are any indigenous people here, that's how you do it. And that's a tradition that continues today, so we continue to have an MA program for people who come from communities with threatened languages and want to work on learning to revive them. So the slander that I showed you a couple slides ago, as far as I can tell, it doesn't begin to resemble what we do. As far as I can tell, what we are doing is building up a picture of how language is put together from data from all over the place. And I've put some of the languages that some of our students and faculty work on up here, by no means all of them. I apologize to any students whose favorite languages are left out. Your languages were chosen partly on the basis of name length, so that I could build could choose. Not a good way to choose. When I talk to linguists who don't have any connection with MIT, don't know anything about MIT except what they've heard, sometimes what they've heard isn't very good, and I have repeatedly been asked questions like, do they allow you to do fieldwork there? And then when I say, oh yes, actually they're quite happy when I do fieldwork there, they then say, well, but do they pay any attention to what you say? When I come back from the field, do those evil MIT linguists, do they listen? Do they pay attention to the data? And so what I wanted to do today was actually, I'm really talking to those people, but I know there are all these other people in the room who are listening to what I'm saying. What I wanted to do was answer those kinds of questions by showing a couple of ways in which data from understudied languages can really have an impact on our understanding of the real core of syntax, the guts of it, as far as I'm concerned. So here's a relation that has become increasingly important over the years. There's some kind of relation between probes and goals. This is an instance of it, a relation between T and, say, the subject, T and a DP. And it's been proposed that relation has all kinds of effects on the syntactic behavior of the DP. Maybe in some languages it causes the DP to raise to the specifier of TP. And arguably also on the morphology, though that's more debatable. So there are theories in which, because T is in an degree relation with DP, the DP becomes nominative, let's say. And there are all kinds of questions we could ask about that relation. So, for example, we could ask those two kinds of effects that it has on the DP, syntactic and morphological, when in the syntactic derivation are those decisions made? That is, when does it happen? So you have that agree relation. Does that agree relation immediately cause the subject to be nominative, for example, or does it wait until after the syntax is over with? It's a point of debate in the literature. People like Jonathan and Alec have weighed in on. And another question that we might ask ourselves is why on earth these kinds of relations happen. There's a classic answer to that Noam gave us, which says, well, because if it didn't happen, terrible, terrible things would happen. The derivation would die, crash. The derivation would crash. There would be an uninterpretable feature that would not be checked, and that would be very bad. That's a kind of answer that's classically been given. So what I want to do today is bring to bear on those classic questions data from 3 lesser-studied languages that are gradually becoming lesser studied, greater studied here at MIT, thanks to work by Ken and some work by me and some work by a couple of recent and soon-to-be recent graduates of our program. So the first of these languages is this language, Lardo. This is a non-Pama-Nyungan language. It's spoken in northern Australia. Ken did the classic work on this language in the 60s, and then he and I worked together on it briefly, and then I have been working on it ever since. So just to do some preliminaries, it's a richly inflected language. You've got a bunch of different cases. This is just a few of them. And in these examples, you can see the cases attaching peacefully to what would be the nominative form if it were by itself. There are lots of places, though, where when you add a suffix to a noun, you add it to something that's slightly different from the nominative form. So here's a word for dugong, and you can see that when you're adding the cases to it, there's this extra vowel, bright red vowel, that shows up when you add the suffixes. Yeah. The bright red vowel is different in different nouns. So in the word for dugong, it's an oo, and in the word for diamond stingray, it's an e. Ken developed the classic analysis of this in terms of truncation. So what's going on here, according to Ken, and Ken unsurprisingly is right, is that when a word is more than 3 syllables long and ends in a vowel, the final vowel will delete. So the word for dugong, for example, is more than 3 syllables long and underlyingly ends in a vowel, oo. When that vowel is final, as in the nominative form, it deletes. If you add a suffix, it doesn't delete because it's not final anymore. And this is just one of many changes that happen between the nominative form and the affixed form, but this is one that will be important for us. Another complication about Lardo suffixation is that these suffixes, their final consonants can sometimes be dropped in casual fast speech. So the accusative suffix is in or just n if you're being very careful, but that final n standardly drops. Similarly, the r that's at the end of the instrumental suffix will standardly drop. And a consequence of that is that in some kinds of examples, like in the dugong and diamond stingray accusative examples, it'll be the case that there will be a null affix. It'll only consist of an n in careful speech, and that final n will be droppable, with the consequence that you'll only be able to see that it's accusative because the final vowel is protected from truncation. Does that make sense? So there will be various places as I go along where I'll be positing null morphemes, null suffixes. And if you're wondering why I'm positing them, this is why. We know that they're there because they're protecting what's before them from the loss that would take place if they were not there. Does that make sense? Yeah, they're not pronounced, but they're there. Okay. That makes sense. Oh, and I'm about to be scanned. In 10 seconds. Wait, shall I defer? Yes. God, it's like being in an airport. Okay. All right. So now there are going to be a couple of morphological processes in Lardo that are going to be important for us. These are concord processes. So Lardo has DP internal concord for case. So if you break a boy's spear, not a nice thing to do, the accusative morpheme will show up on the word for spear, but also on the possessor, on the genitive. So you say, so you get the E, not just on spear, but also on boys. Yeah. If you make it nominative, say by passivizing, or by putting the verb in the imperative, so objects of imperatives are nominative in Lardo if they're third person, then you don't get those suffixes, you just get the nominative form, that is the unaffixed form. Similarly, you get case spreading into relative clauses. So here's an example where the object is accusative, tree is accusative, and you also get accusative morphology on the subject and verb of the relative clause that modify the tree. So the subject is genitive, there's something like ga no conversion going on here. So you get here's one of the places where I told you I was going to posit a null morpheme, so there's nothing pronounced at the end of cut future, but you can tell that it's there because the final vowel of the future has not been dropped. And if we make the tree nominative by putting that in the imperative, then the accusative doesn't show up. Okay, that's one kind of concord. Lardo has another kind of concord, tense concord. So here's a sentence in the past tense. I slowly cooked the pumpkin head. Pumpkin head is a kind of fish. It's not an insult. And if we put that in the future tense, we get future morphology on the verb, but also on everything in the verb phrase. Mark alluded to this yesterday in related language, gardel. So you get it on the verb and on the object and on certain adverbs, but not others. So really high adverbs don't get this, but low adverbs do. So the tense is really spreading over the entire verb phrase. Okay. Now, this tense concord interacts in different ways with different kinds of morphology. So here's a sentence where the verb phrase contains both an object and an instrumental. If you put that in the future, the object switches from being accusative to being future. So it's no longer marked accusative, it's only marked future. Fishing spear, by contrast, is marked both instrumental and future, so it gets both of the morphemes. Okay. So future replaces accusative, but not instrumental. Now, I just said it replaces accusative, and we really do want to think, apparently, of the derivation as going, you assign accusative to the object, and then later you assign future to the object and wipe out the accusative that it used to have. Here's a reason to think of it that way. This is something that Ken noticed. If you modify a future object with a relative clause, the relative clause is going to get the case that the future object should have, that is accusative. Right? So I want to see the wallaby that my older brother speared. Wallaby is future. It's not marked accusative, but the accusative that should be on the wallaby that has been oppressed by the future is showing up on the relative clause. Yeah? So you're getting those accusatives in blue there on older brother and on spear. Okay. Now, so what happens is that if you have something that's accusative and you assign future to it, the future wipes out the accusative. And this is not because it's just that future and accusative are incompatible with each other. So it has to do with the order in which they are assigned. So for example, if you have a future, control verbs or control clauses are marked future in Lardo, just tell the boy to dance. And control clauses agree in case, they have case concord with their controller. So I told the boy to dance, the boy becomes accusative, and you get accusative stacking outside of future, right, showing up as a protection of the final vowel of the future morpheme. Okay. So if you have future and then accusative, you get them both. It's only if you get accusative and then future that the future wipes out the underlying accusative. So it's important for this story that accusative, in this last example, is assigned before, restart later. That accusative is assigned before future tense concord. We don't want to do those things in the other order. We've seen what happens when you do them in the other order. Okay. So this tells us something about the order of operations. You assign accusative before you do future tense concord. Now, when do you do future tense concord? Well, I think there are two reasons to say that you do future tense concord during the narrow syntactic derivation. Two arguments. First, its properties are sensitive to the semantics of the case that it's interacting with. And second, has to do with its bleeding relations with movement operations. So we'll go through those in turn. First, I already showed you that future replaces accusative, but it doesn't replace instrumental. More generally, it replaces meaningless cases. It doesn't replace meaningful cases. So here's a place where we want the semantics and the morphology to talk to each other. And the only place that I know of where they get to do that is in the syntax. So this is one reason to do all this in the syntax. This property of future tense concord is sort of reminiscent of Russian genitive of negation. Russian genitive of negation also replaces accusative, but doesn't replace instrumental. It doesn't wipe out instrumental. Russian isn't a case stacking language, so you don't see instrumental followed by genitive in the last example. I said casually that Russian isn't a case stacking language. See my colleague David Pozetsky for arguments that it is, actually, in a particularly sneaky way. Second argument has to do with bleeding relations with movement operations. So here's a case of tense concord. You've got future on the whole verb phrase. The dog will bite the woman. That concord is bled by passive. So passivization moves the woman out of the domain of tense concord. So you get bingen bedo. Right? So the woman, now that she's the subject, is no longer marked future. On the other hand, WH movement does not bleed tense concord. So if you WH extract the object, that doesn't cause it to escape tense concord. So who is still in its future form in the last example. Okay, well, we can have a sort of account of those times of bleeding relations in terms of the syntactic cycle. So we think that passive happens before WH movement in these kinds of examples, right? Passive lands in a position that's lower than WH movement does. So if we're willing to say that tense concord happens in between those operations, we have an account of the bleeding operations, right? So passive will happen first, concord will happen second, and it will apply to, say, WH objects that are still in the verb phrase, but not to passivized objects. Those have already escaped. And then WH movement will apply last. Moreover, we don't just want to say, probably, that this is just a difference between A movement and A bar movement. Here's why. I just tried to convince you that Russian is really Lardo in a particularly underhanded way. Russian passive and Lardo passive behave differently for their respective morphological operations. So I told you that passive bleeds tense concord in Lardo. It doesn't bleed genitive of negation in Russian, so there's an example there. Why would that be? Well, it would be because negation is lower than tense. So because negation is lower than tense, it's applied before tense, given our standard assumptions about the syntactic cycle, and so passive in Russian can't escape that operation. So when does this happen? Where by this I mean the determination of morphological form. Well, in this particular case, it seems to happen in the narrow syntax, giving you a couple of operations for that, both tense concord and case assignment. So that's one language, Lardo. Here's another language, Zulu. I should say, before I go on from Lardo, that sadly, Lardo, the version of Lardo that I've just been telling you about is dead. There's nobody left who controls this morphology. There are people who speak Lardo without its morphology, and who can blame them. But there's no one left who commands the morphology that I've just been describing to you. So please feel free to ask me questions, but I may very well not be able to answer them. That moves us on to Zulu, which is not dead. So I tried to convince you a second ago. Oops. I'm going backwards. There we go. This is work by Claire Halpert, one of our current grads. So here's a Zulu sentence, and the Zulu nouns in here contain these morphemes called augments, these vowels that show up at the beginnings of these nouns, which agree with the noun in noun class. So egg, ikanda, has an E at the beginning of it that's telling you, among other things, that it's class 5. It doesn't have to have that augment, so you can get rid of that augment. That's what I've done in this slide. And that has consequences for the semantics of the egg, so the egg becomes an NPI. And it also has consequences for its syntax. It can only show up in certain structural positions, but not others. So it can be here, right after the verb. Similarly, in a VSO sentence, you can have the subject right after the verb. That's in the second example. But in a VSO sentence, you cannot have the object without an augment. That's the last example. So the generalization is that the augmentless noun has to be the highest nominal in the verb phrase. For reasons of time, I can't go through all the cool evidence for that. If you'd like to hear it, feel free to ask me, or better yet, Claire, later on. Now, the augmentless nominal has to be the highest in the VP, little VP, but it can't be moved out of that position. So this is not like case checking. It's not that you become augmentless and then you go on with your happy life. So here's another example of a post-verbal subject which is augmentless. Moving that post-verbal subject to pre-verbal position, even if you helpfully supply it with an NPI licensing adverb, doesn't help. It's still bad. So it has to be the highest in the little VP, and it can't get out of there afterwards. Similarly, movement, so this is one kind of effect that movement has. Movement can destroy the licensing conditions for augmentless nominals. It can also create them. So the first example is an example where the object is augmentless, but presumably the underlying form for that has the subject in a lower position, the lower position it's in the second example. The second example is starred. So what this is telling us is that movement of the subject out into the higher position in the first example is making it possible for the object to become augmentless. Right? So what we're learning from this is that Zulu augmentlessness is licensed after all of these movement operations take place, apparently. Right? So these things have to be the highest in the little VP after all the movement operations have taken place, not before. Okay. So I tried to show that in Lardo, there was a set of morphological operations that were taking place in the narrow syntax, interacting with syntactic movement operations in a way that suggested that they were taking place in the narrow syntax. The licensing of Zulu augmentlessness is apparently happening after these movement operations take place, possibly post-syntactically, possibly just late in the syntactic cycle. I won't offer a theory about that. So apparently we live in a world where the answer to the question of, are morphological operations taking place in the syntax or late in the syntax or post-syntactically, the answer to that question is yes. Right? So we have to study each of these types of operations and try to understand when they occur. This is a conclusion that's, I think, pretty compatible with certain approaches to distributed morphology, where the whole point is that morphology is well distributed over the whole derivation. This seems to be an instance of that. Okay, last example in the remaining couple of minutes comes from a Mayan language, Kaqchikel. Kaqchikel agent, in particular, Kaqchikel agent focus. So if you are focusing an agent in Kaqchikel, the agreement morphology on the verb goes completely nuts. So ordinarily, the verbs in this language agree with both the subject and the object. But if you focus the subject, they completely change their needs and desires. Suddenly, they want really badly to agree with things that are second person. So in examples like the ones that are here on the board, we do not care whether the subject or the object is you. We're looking for a you, and we will agree with it. We will ignore completely third person things. This is not an unfamiliar type of agreement, but so here it is in red. It's not just you, it's also me. People may say that to you all the time. So you get agreement with you, but also agreement with me, ignoring the man. This is something that happens in this language. Now, here's the two interesting things. One is, if you and me are both in the sentence, then you die. So the verb doesn't know who to agree with. Actually, what it does is agree with both, so you get a different type of construction. But here's the interesting thing, which Omer Preminger in his recent dissertation really concentrates on. Consider a sentence like the one that we have on this slide, where the subject and the object are both third person. Well, we've established that these verbs don't care about third person things. They badly want to agree with things that are first or second person. They completely ignore third person things. They rummage through the sentence looking for things that are first or second person, totally discarding third person things. So how about if there are only third person things? Well, oh well. Apparently, these morphemes badly want to agree with things that are first or second person, but in the words of the great English philosopher Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want. That's the conclusion. And Omer and Claire have been working together, discovering instances of this in Zulu that go beyond what I can say in my now negative time. So I encourage you to ask them about that. This seems to be a general property. So when do morphological operations take place? Sometimes in the narrow syntax, maybe sometimes after narrow syntactic movement operations. What would go wrong if agreement failed? Well, apparently nothing. We don't want a system in which there are terrible, awful, uninterpretable features hanging around that will cause you to die if you don't check them off. Apparently you would like to check them off, and you are supposed to try. It's important that you try, but if you fail, then it's okay, you tried. That's the important thing. It's kind of a reassuring lesson for all of us, I think. I've hit the wrong arrow again. Okay. And I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Uh-oh. Later. Are my slides?
They're somewhere in here.
Somewhere in here.
Okay, so this, let's see, the help, where is it? Oh, here he's coming down here, so he will. Yeah, so we just have to get out of this back to her slide. Okay, so.
Okay, so I'll get started. Thanks very much. I'm really honored to be speaking here. And I want to use my part of the session to talk a little bit about the impact of native speakers of endangered languages. And in particular, I'll talk a little bit about work on case and syntactic ergativity in these languages and the relation between the two. How do I get to the next slide? Okay, so this is collaborative work with two people, with Pedro Mateo Pedro, who is currently a postdoc in Masha Polinsky's lab at Harvard, and also Omer Preminger, a recent MIT grad who is dividing his time now between Masha's lab and teaching here. I couldn't find a picture of them together, so I made them smile at each other here. So this is a picture of the Mayan family. It consists of about 30 languages. And today I'll focus mostly on Chol, which is the language that I work on, which you see in dark blue near the top, and on Khanhobal in lighter blue near the middle, which is the language that Pedro works on and which he also is a native speaker of. I won't talk about Kakchikel, which is what Omer has been working on and what Norvin told you a little bit about earlier, but that also plays an important role in our analysis. These languages are spoken throughout southern Mexico and Guatemala. And I first started working on Chol as an undergraduate. So I started working in this village that you see there on the left. It's called Campanario, and it's in Chiapas. I spent 2 summers and winters there when I was an undergraduate. And I came to MIT in 2005. And when I told people that I wanted to go to grad school at MIT, I think some people were surprised because I'm somebody who wanted to do field work and work on endangered languages. And so people asked me, why would you go to MIT? But I think actually it's something that shouldn't surprise us at all. So first of all, if this sign on a language school in Chiapas is any indication, there's some support for generative grammar in southern Mexico. I never actually went to this language school, but I enjoyed the sign. But perhaps more importantly, as Norvin pointed out, and as I'm sure all of you know, there's been plenty of work on endangered languages coming out of MIT and field work, of course, as well. And I just wanted to start with this quote from Ken Hale, which I find inspirational. So I'll just read it. He says, "The future of American Indian linguistics will depend critically on how successful an effort there is to engage American Indians in the active study of their own languages, not as informants as in the past, but as linguists, philologists, lexicographers, creative writers, and the like. To put it another way, significant advances in the study of American Indian languages can be made, in my judgment, only when a significant portion of the field is in the hands of native speakers of the languages concerned." And Mayan languages are nice to talk about in this venue because I think a lot of they're really working towards this goal. So in addition to inspiring many others, of course, Hale himself helped train speakers of Tohono O'odham, Hopi, Navajo, Adna, and others. And perhaps lesser known is he also spent time in Guatemala teaching classes to Maya native speaker linguists there. And the contributions of native speaker linguists of Mayan language, as I just mentioned, are perhaps unparalleled in the world of endangered languages and underdocumented languages. Nora England has a nice paper on this. And this is thanks in part to programs like the one at CSS, which you see a picture of there. So they have an MA program in Indo-American linguistics, which is focused specifically on training native speakers to work on their languages. It began in 1991. And since then, there have been 90 MA theses that came out of this program, 22 of these on Mayan languages, the others from languages all over Central America. So in syntax alone, I just give you a list of some of the work there. And the first generation of PhDs are now underway. So that's Mexico. There are also Mayan languages in Guatemala, and a lot of great work is being done by native speakers there. So there's been a lot of work coming out of OCMA, which unfortunately lost funding recently, but also university programs there. And our collaborator, Pedro, is currently collaborating to get an MA program built up in Guatemala. So hopefully that will start soon. And we had a chance to see a lot of this great work coming together at the first Formal Approaches to Mayan Linguistics conference, which took place here at MIT in April 2010, in which a lot of people here helped put together. Of the 30 presentations there, half were presented by native speakers of Mayan languages, which I think just gives you a sense of how much work is being done there. I've included some of the nice pictures that Micho, who's been around here with the camera, took there. Okay, but I want to talk a little bit about syntactic ergativity as an example of some of the work that we've been doing. So this work is appropriate, I think, for this session for 2 reasons. First, it would have been impossible without the many contributions native speaker linguists have made to our understanding of Mayan, both descriptively and theoretically. And second, it builds on old and recent discoveries in generative linguistics made by many of you here. And sort of the bigger picture point, I think, is that the combination of these 2 lines of work, so careful work on underdocumented and endangered languages, coupled with formal tools to understand what we're looking at, results in a more complete understanding of the range and limits of cross-linguistic variation, which is, of course, good for everybody. Okay, so this work begins with the intuition in Adán Pascual's 2007 CSS thesis that the suffix on in Canjobal should receive a unified analysis. So this suffix shows up in two initially sort of disparate-seeming environments. The first is what Norvin mentioned, so an agent-focused construction. So here you see when you extract a transitive subject, you have to have the suffix on the verb phrase, so makcham mashachiloni, husayu. And then you also find it in embedded transitives regardless of whether or not any extraction has taken place. So she can see you, you have to have the suffix on, and we'll look at these in more detail. So what do these constructions have in common? And we think a clue from Hiroaki Tada's 1993 MIT dissertation will help us solve this puzzle. So just a little bit of background. Mayan languages show morphological ergativity via person marking on the predicate. So I give you two examples from Chol here. I'll try to consistently mark the absolutives in red and the ergatives in blue, so you see that the transitive object patterns with the intransitive subject, and the ergative prefix is reserved for transitive subjects. We also see clause initial aspect markers throughout the family. Those are highlighted here in pink, and we'll assume that these are instantiations of a high clausal head in full. And then finally, we'll see these status suffixes that indicate transitivity, and we'll assume that these are instances of little v. Okay, so while the basic ordering of morphemes in the verb stem is pretty consistent across the family, so you get aspect, the root with an ergative prefix, possibly any voice morphology, and then these status suffixes, we do find variation in the location of the absolutive marker. Thanks. So in what we're going to refer to as high abs languages, the absolutive marker immediately follows the aspect marker. It shows up between aspect and ergative, whereas in low abs languages, it appears at the end of the verb stem consistently. So Canjobal and Chol illustrate these two contrasts. So you see that we have these pretty cognate-looking forms in both the languages, but we see variation in where, in this case, the second person absolutive marker shows up. In Canjobal, it shows up high, and in Chol, it shows up low. And what Tada noticed is that the location of the absolutive morpheme, whether or not it's high or low, correlates with the appearance of extraction asymmetries. So languages that have high absolutives have extraction asymmetries, whereas languages that have low absolutive lack asymmetries. The italicized languages are the ones that weren't present in Tada's original work, but which we were able to find new data on, and with two exceptions which look different in other ways, which we go into in our paper, but I don't have time to talk about here. These languages fall nicely into these two categories. So what do I mean by extraction asymmetries? In low abs languages like Chol, there aren't any, and all core arguments freely extract. So transitive subjects and absolutives, they A-bar extract for questions, focus, and relativization. Nothing special happens. Whereas in high abs languages like Canjobal, absolutive arguments extract freely, whereas ergatives do not. So you need to do something special if you want to extract the ergative subject, and this is what an instance of syntactic ergativity. So the syntax is paying attention to this difference. So just to illustrate, in Chol, mashkiti liyet, husayu, no problem, whereas in Canjobal, if I try to do the same thing, ungrammaticality results. So we'll assume, following other work, that the absolutive arguments here are pronominal clitics. They look very similar to the full pronoun forms. And a first approximation that we'll make is that the high location of the absolutive in Canjobal in 10, no, is blocking the ergative from extracting. So now I'll flesh this out in some more detail. But the first question I'll address is, why is the absolutive high in some languages and not others? And so why should it be getting in the way and causing this problem? And here we will adopt recent work made by Julie Leggett and independently by Edith Aldridge, which proposes that what ergative languages have in common is that the ergative argument is licensed in situ by some mechanism, which isn't crucial for us here. But with respect to absolutive, they come in two basic types. So one type is that absolutive is basically nominative. So it's assigned uniformly by the head of the finite clause. So in a transitive, the subject gets skipped, and in full assigns absolutive to the object. And the second type is that absolutive is basically a morphological default in these other type of languages. So it might be assigned by little v to transitive objects, but by inful to intransitive subjects. So essentially we have accusative and nominative, but what's special in these languages is there aren't different morphological realizations. So this is just a morphological default of different abstract case mechanisms. And the proposal that we want to make is that the division between high abs languages and low abs languages lines up nicely with this, what it calls abs equals def and abs equals nom. So low abs languages are abs equals def, and in high abs languages, the absolutive is getting case from inful. There's independent evidence for this, so if absolutive is consistently coming from the head of a finite clause, we expect it to be unavailable in non-finite environments. And this is true for Conhobal, whereas in Chol you can get embedded absolutive in some cases, and this seems to be true across the family. Okay, so this, as I mentioned before, lines up with whether or not ergatives extract. So the question now is in Conhobal, what is causing the problem with ergatives to extract? And so, again, in Conhobal, we assume that absolutive is assigned by inful, so it's an abs equals nom language. And little v is instantiated by the status suffixes. So E is the transitive, E is intransitive, and a vowel glottal stop is the transitive. And crucially, transitive little v, so the one that assigns ergative case, is phasal. So here's, again, an example of a transitive clause. And so here's the structure we'll propose for just a basic transitive. So importantly, so we have the verb and then the subject, and we have this little VP, which is instantiated by the status suffix, thanks. And if it assigns ergative, it's phasal. There's an EPP feature on this little v, which attracts the absolutive argument to its specifier, and this allows the absolutive to get licensed by inful. So if it stayed down low, this wouldn't be possible. But crucially, because this little v head is phasal, the subject is now trapped. So if the object raises to get case, so we're assuming there's only a single specifier for little v in these languages. So if the object gets case, then the subject is trapped. And that's the problem with extracting ergatives in Conhobal. And in Chol, of course, the object doesn't need to raise for case, and so we don't have this problem. So how does agent focus solve the problem? Again, to extract a transitive subject, we have to use this agent focus construction that we began with. So here we have the suffix on. And these constructions have been described as syntactically transitive but morphologically intransitive. So transitive because we have two full DP arguments, so this is not an antipassive. So here in pink, the who and the you, neither one of them are demoted. But intransitive because there's no ergative agreement on 14, so you don't see the prefix on the verb. I've put a transitive in 15 so you can compare. And now you see the intransitive status suffix, again, even though we have two full DPs. And so the proposal we want to make is, recall the problem with extracting the ergative is that the absolutive is raising for case and getting in the way. So what agent focus does to fix this problem is it's a voice head which assigns case to the object. So the object now doesn't need to get case from inful. Instead, the subject can get case from inful, which means that ergative in turn doesn't need to be assigned. So this results in the absence of ergative agreement morphology and also the appearance of the intransitive or non-ergative assigning little v status suffix. And crucially, because this one is not phasal, the subject is now free to extract. So again, the appearance of this transitive status suffix gives us an indication for us that correlates with phasehood. Here we have the intransitive status suffix, and the case assignment goes along with this, and so now we can extract out of this. We make a couple of predictions that I'll go through quickly. So under this account, syntactic ergativity, at least in Mayan, is not a problem with the ergative subject itself. So this isn't something going wrong with ergatives in particular. But it can be characterized instead as the need for the object to get case from a high functional head above the subject. And this high position of the object in turn blocks the subject from extracting. And as we predict, certain ergative marked transitive subjects can extract, and they can extract exactly in the environments in which we would predict they would be able to, namely in which the object doesn't need case. So ergative arguments can extract from a clause with reflexive objects. As you see in 17, here it's actually impossible to use the agent focus, even though we're extracting an agent, Machel Mashil Shpa, who saw herself. And at least in some dialects of Quiché, as Judith Asen has shown in recent work, they can extract things from clauses with bare non-referential objects, as in 18, so who bought cloth. There's independent evidence that these objects don't require case from word order and noun class clitics, and so we'll propose that instead they get licensed in situ. And so the ability for the ergative to extract in these environments falls out naturally from our account. I'll go quickly through the second prediction. So if this agent-focused morpheme is a type of last resort case assigner, we might expect to find it in other environments where absolutive is unavailable. And this is exactly what we find. So in non-finite embedded clauses, the single argument of an intransitive is marked ergative genitive, so we don't run into the problem with no absolutive. And in most high abs languages, you simply can't have an embedded transitive. You have to either anti-passivize or passivize. Kandhawalan languages do allow embedded transitives, but only with the suffix on. So this is coming back to the initial two examples we came back to. So we find it only in embedded transitives, and this is exactly where absolutive case would otherwise be impossible. Okay, so to summarize, ergatives are unable to extract from regular transitives because the absolutive raises in these high abs languages above ergative in order to get licensed. Transitive VP is phasal, so the subject is trapped inside the phase. And this explains the correlation between high absolutive and syntactic ergativity, the fact that ergative extraction is fine so long as the object doesn't need case, and the appearance of the AF morpheme in non-finite clauses. So to conclude, to bring back to the original discussion of native speaker linguists and the importance that they have on for work in linguistics. So I think native speaker linguists are clearly good for linguistics. So a lot of great work is coming out, especially in Mayan, but in other areas also. And I've tried to illustrate some of this work, which you couldn't see in detail here, but we bring in data from a lot of other languages that we just wouldn't know anything about if it weren't for a lot of the great work going on. But native speaker linguists are also good for endangered languages. So I have a quote here from Judith Asen. So when you have native speakers doing scientific work on a language, it has the effect of raising the importance of preserving it. And this is something that we've seen in the Mayan family. And native speaker linguists are, of course, also good for language communities on both cultural and socio-political levels. So Nora England has documented some of the political advances that Mayans have been able to make in large part due to work on their languages. And then I'll end with another quote from Ken Hale. So, of supreme significance in relation to linguistic diversity and to local languages in particular is the simple truth that language, in the general multifaceted sense, embodies the intellectual wealth of the people who use it. Mayan languages aren't the only languages that have great work by native speakers, and MIT has actually played a role. MIT graduates have played a large role in this. So work in Africa at the African Linguistics School began by Chris Collins and Enoch Abo and others, and Claire Halpert taught there this summer. Work in South America at the South American Summer School, work by Andres and Pranav and Guillaume, and also a current student, Rafael, who's working to train native speakers of Quiseje as part of a grant project. There's work in Nicaragua that Ken Hale began with Elena Benedicto and Tom Green and others. Of course, the Wampanoag Reclamation Project and the MA program here at MIT. And I'm sure I'm missing many people, and I apologize, but this is just sort of an example of a lot of the work that is going on. So some thank yous there. All right, thanks. And you can find out what later.
Okay, so thank you all so very much for inviting me to be a part of this incredible event in this particular session. So the general topic for this session is the question, what have understudied and endangered languages and their speakers taught us? And for this presentation, I would like to focus on the sub-question, what have these languages taught us about the semantics syntax interface? That is, what are some things that we've learned from these languages via research informed by semantic theory. And then before discussing some particular results, I'd like to begin by pointing out that this kind of research is by no means a recent phenomenon. That is, theoretically informed semantic research into understudied and endangered languages has been going on for pretty much as long as there has been semantic theory. So to name some salient examples, in the 1960s and 70s, we saw formal semantic research based upon such languages as Nuchalnuth, Hittite, Finnish, Kikuyu. And in the 1980s, there was formal semantic work upon languages like Thai, Tagalog, Georgian Maricopa, and Korean. And in the early 90s, there were major works on Arabic and Hindi, for example. On the other hand, it's true that semantic research into understudied languages has really blossomed dramatically since the mid-1990s. In particular, since such landmark works as Maria Bittner's framework for cross-linguistic semantics, Eloise Jelinek's work on the Lummi branch of Straight Salish, the monumental 2-volume work on quantification across languages edited by Emin Bach, Eloise Jelinek, Angelica Kratzer, and Barbara Partee, and of course Lisa Matheson's groundbreaking 1998 book examining in exquisite formal detail the syntax and semantics of quantification in Lillooet Salish. So since the appearance of these works, it's fair to say that the amount of theoretically informed semantic research into understudied and endangered languages has rather skyrocketed. We could always use more such work. The continuance of this work is very critical in the expansion of it, but we've already passed the point where it would be impossible to draw up anything like a comprehensive list. Now, we might ask the question, why? Why has it been, within the past 10 years, we've seen such a relatively dramatic expansion of this kind of semantic research? And I think it's due to 3 factors that bear mentioning. The first is that this expansion is part of an overall general expanse and integration of formal semantics into linguistics more broadly. That is, especially since the publication of such landmark textbooks as Hyman Kratzer's and Kirakia McConnell-Genet, formal semantics has become more widely taught at both the graduate and undergraduate level, and so is very naturally becoming more integrated widely within other sub-branches of linguistics and within the cognitive sciences more generally. A second factor behind this more recent blossoming of this kind of work is I think there's been an emergence of a kind of critical mass of prior work. That is, enough earlier work now exists that one is rather, rarely breaking completely new methodological ground in their own work, and consequently there's emerged a rather productive kind of identifiable program or paradigm, to use the Coonian term, for doing semantic fieldwork, first explicitly formulated in Lisa Matheson's 2004 article in IJAL. There's a third factor at work, I believe, that should be noted, and that is I think there's a particularly fortunate alignment between formal truth-conditional semantic theory and the practice of eliciting judgments in a field interview, in that people are actually rather good, confident, and comfortable in offering judgments of the truthfulness or felicity or factual correctness of sentences in particular imagined scenarios, and are perhaps more comfortable doing that kind of a task than in offering judgments about other linguistic properties, such as perhaps well-formedness. And this aligns very well with the general framework for truth-conditional semantic theory, where the theory is designed to predict the truth and felicity of sentences in particular scenarios. And I think that's definitely one reason that semantic fieldwork utilizing truth-conditional semantics has been particularly productive. So I'm going to return to the question now, what have understudied and endangered languages taught us about the semantic-syntax interface? And I want to begin by answering it somewhat negatively by talking about something that this work hasn't shown us, that there is in any sense overall more linguistic variation at the semantic-syntax interface than we might have expected. Now, there certainly have been discovered areas of linguistic variation that had not been anticipated by any particular framework or individual. So, for example, the existence of languages that allow indexicals to shift their reference in intentional contexts, or languages that freely permit and actually often employ what seem to be violations of Principle C. But on the other hand, there's also areas where we found more uniformity than was perhaps generally believed just about 15 years ago. So, for example, just 15 years ago, there were a great many languages that were thought not to possess lexical category distinctions. However, as detailed, theoretically informed study of those languages progressed, many have been found to indeed have a classical three-way category distinction, distinguishing between nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So the semantic syntactic variation that we've discovered along the way is different from what might have been imagined 20, definitely 50 years ago, but it's not on the whole greater in any sense of greater. But what have understudied and endangered languages shown us about semantics, or this cross-linguistic variation in the interface with syntax? Well, what I'd like to do for the next 12 minutes or so is look at two particular specific results that have emerged, namely the phenomenon of indexical shift and also the existence of modals with what seem to be variable quantificational force or strength. Why did I pick these two examples? Well, neither are subject areas that I myself have contributed to, but they happen to be two of my own personal favorites, ones that I can kind of describe in about 12 minutes, and they nicely illustrate the kind of work currently done by numerous other individuals. And I think they nicely illustrate a general point that as more languages are analyzed in greater theoretical depth, we find that the variation that does exist is a lot more curious and subtle than we might have a priori imagined. Now, across both these particular examples and across the field as a whole, I think you can identify two general themes. Neither will come as a surprise to any of you here, but it's worth highlighting them. The first is that linguistic theory advances the documentation of exotic phenomena in understudied languages, for the simple reason that attempting to the activity of describing or analyzing these phenomena in terms of the theory prompts deeper empirical questions about those phenomena. It's as unavoidable as the sun following the rain. The second general theme I'd like to identify is that theoretically informed study of exotic phenomena often lead us to reevaluate our analyses of better studied phenomena in better studied languages. That is, there's quite a many works where the analyses of some phenomenon in an understudied language seems to challenge previous widely held analyses of related phenomena in well-studied majority languages. And perhaps one of the best-known cases of this is Lisa Mathewson's 2001 paper on ad-nominal quantifiers in Lillooet, where she argues that we should reconsider the view that such quantifiers in English are ever actually determiners. So that's the broader picture against which I'd like to discuss a few, or namely two, recent kinds of works that investigate semantic issues in understudied languages. So the first is indexical shift. And to describe this phenomenon to you, I have to make clear what an indexical is. So basically, indexical expressions include local person pronouns like I, we, and you, certain locative pronouns like here and there, and certain temporal expressions like now, yesterday, and tomorrow. Why do we call these things indexicals? Why do we have this special label for distinguishing them from other context-sensitive items? Well, one major factor concerns their behavior in indirect speech contexts, where we find that indexicals exhibit a kind of characteristic property of intentional insensitivity. So to see this, I'm going to have some contrived examples up here, but to see this, suppose that Dave reports his hunger with the sentence, "The person speaking is hungry." It's a little bit contrived, but imaginable. You could report Dave's utterance with the sentence, Dave said that the person speaking was hungry. It's again a bit contrived but imaginable. The main point being here that the expression, the person speaking, needn't actually refer to the actual person currently speaking. But if Dave decided to report his hunger with a much more natural sentence, I am hungry, you definitely could never report his utterance with the sentence, Dave said I was hungry. You could only ever report it with Dave said he is hungry. So the pronoun I always has to refer to the person actually currently speaking in the context. So what accounts for this intentional insensitivity? Well, since the work of David Kaplan, the general view has been something like the following. And here the overall analysis can be divided into two parts. The first part concerns the semantics of indexicals and non-indexicals themselves. So first we can hypothesize that natural language expressions are interpreted relative to both a context C and an index, which consists minimally of a world W and a time T. Next, we assume that the semantic value of an indexical is determined by the context and not kind of contrary to the nomenclature by the index. So relative to a context C, the pronoun I will refer to the speaker in that context C. And finally, we assume that the semantic value of non-indexicals is determined, kind of confusingly, by the index. So relative to a index W and T, the semantic value of the description, the person speaking, will be the unique X, such that X is a person speaking at world W and time T. The second part of the classic analysis concerns the semantics of natural language operators. And it's more or less the stipulation, okay, that intentional operators in natural language only ever shift the index of evaluation and never the context of evaluation. So, for example, if the semantics of believe is as I have stated up here, then it effectively shifts the interpretation index of the subordinate clause to those worlds and times that are consistent with the beliefs of the subject, but the contextual parameter stays the same across the two clauses. So any expression whose interpretation is dependent upon that contextual parameter will receive the same interpretation in the subordinate clause as it would in the matrix clause. This is illustrated just with this little partial semantic derivation here, where if you take the sentence, Dave believes that I am hungry, and imagine the context to be one where Bill is the speaker, well, when we come down to interpreting the local person pronoun I, it's interpreted relative to that context. So it'll be the speaker in that context, and so it'll refer to Bill. And it could never, ever, ever shift its denotation to something like Dave, the subject of the matrix clause. So as I mentioned, the second part of this classic analysis for indexicals holds that intensional operators never shift the context of interpretation, only the index. And this stipulation makes a rather obvious empirical prediction, one that's come to be known as the ban against monsters. And this prediction, of course, is that no natural languages will have intensional operators that allow the morphosyntactic equivalent of the sentence, Dave thinks I'm hungry, spoken by, say, Bill, to mean Dave thinks I am hungry. Dave thinks Dave is hungry. Such operators were said by Kaplan to be monstrous. Well, the fact is that as first systematically shown by Philippe Schlenker in his 1999 dissertation from this department, monsters exist. So there are natural languages that allow embedded first-person pronouns to be co-referent with a third-person matrix subject. So Philippe famously noted the existence of this phenomenon in Amharic, and then Pranav Anand in his 2006 dissertation, also from this department, examined a variety of other languages where this kind of indexical shift can take place. But in all these examples that you see here, we find that an embedded first-person marker can be understood as co-referent with a matrix subject. Now, upon seeing these kinds of examples, you should naturally ask yourself the question, how do I know these aren't just cases of direct quotation, right? Sentences like English, Dave said, quote, I am hungry. And both Philippe and Pranav provide a litany of arguments against treating these as cases of direct quotation. I have rather two convincing ones stated here on the slides and also on your handouts that you can look at your leisure. But the long and short of it is that clauses with these shifted indexicals pass well-known diagnostics for indirect speech rather than direct or quoted speech. So thanks to this work, we know that monsters exist. They are a real phenomenon of human language. But how do they exist? What is the proper way of understanding these cases of indexical shift? And here I'd like to highlight the work of Pranav Anand in Nevins 2004, as well as Anand 2006, because this work argues that analyses of shifted indexicals should capture several key generalizations that seem to hold across many cases. And what I'd like to do here is just note this one fun generalization, the one that goes by the name of shift together, which states that all shiftable indexicals within an attitude context have to pick up their reference from the same context parameter. So in a sentence that is the morphosyntactic equivalent of the English sentence, Dave told Mary that Bill told Sue that I like you, there's only three possible values that the indexicals could have. They could either refer to the actual utterance speaker and addressee, so me and you. The indexical I can refer to Dave and you can refer to Mary, or I can refer to Bill and you to Sue. But any other imaginable interpretation is not possible. So I could not refer to Dave and you to Sue. So we know, thanks to this work, that a theory of indexical shift has to do more than just predict its possibility. It also has to predict this phenomenon of shift together. And Anand 2006, building from Nevins and Anand 2004, develops a theory that does just this. The main idea behind the story, which I'll only briefly sketch out here, is that diagonalization operations of the kind imagined by Stolnacher in 1978 do exist in natural languages. And what these kinds of operators do, more or less, is that they make the contextual parameter identical to the index. And so in this way, expressions whose meaning is tied to the contextual parameter will appear to be determined by the index in certain environments. For my purposes here, I'll have to refer you, of course, to that literature for more details on the analysis, but I'd like to highlight some of its broader consequences. So first, as mentioned a second ago, one result of this work is that diagonalization operators are an actual object of human language. Secondly, Anand shows how this theory of indexical shift provides new perspectives on the nature of long-distance reflexives in so-called day-say readings. So it provides us another example of how study of exotic phenomena in understudied languages can lead us to reevaluate our theories of more commonly encountered phenomena in better studied languages. The next phenomenon I'd like to talk about was rather unheard of just 5 years ago, but has since been studied rather intensely, particularly at the University of British Columbia, whose department has emerged as a real leader in the area of semantic research into understudied languages. And the phenomenon in question is the existence in some languages of modals whose quantificational force, or more informally, whose strength, seems to be contextually determined. So to properly introduce this phenomenon, let's first consider the properties of modal auxiliaries in languages like English. So first, since Kripke 1959, to pick a particular date, it's been accepted that these auxiliaries function semantically as quantifiers over possible worlds. And moreover, for each auxiliary, its quantificational force is determined lexically. So strong necessity modals are specified in the lexicon to contribute universal force, and weak possibility modals are specified in the lexicon to contribute existential force. Secondly, since the work of Kratzer 1977, it's been accepted that while the quantificational force of the modal is specified in the lexicon, it's the linguistic context determines the understood domain of quantification of the modal or its modal base. Moreover, the modal bases themselves can be categorized into these different types, and the type of the modal base determines which of those long-recognized readings the modal sentence has, so whether the modal statement is epistemic, deontic, or circumstantial. So an epistemic reading of a sentence like Dave must be here is obtained in a context where the modal base is the world's consistent with our knowledge, so the overall truth conditions come out, of course, as in all the world's consistent with our knowledge, Dave is here. So in the best studied European languages, the quantificational force of a modal is fixed in the lexicon, and the type of its domain of quantification or modal base is supplied by the context. Amazingly, however, there are languages where the opposite setup seems to hold. Okay? That is first extensively documented by Ruhlman et al. 2008. There's languages where it seems that the modal base, the type of modal base of the modal is fixed in the lexicon, and the quantificational force is supplied by the context. So this was first studied by Ruhlman et al. 2008 for the language Lillooet Salish, known as Streitlemchech to its friends. And it's since been looked at in the language Gixam by Peterson 2010, and more recently in the language Nez Perce by Deal 2011. And to get a sense of what's being claimed for these languages, I'll take a quick look at the Lillooet Salish modal system. And the first thing to note is that modality in Lillooet is expressed through these series of these indeclinable particles. And the first thing to note about these particles is that each is permitted only one type of modal base. So as shown here, this particle ka, way up at the top, is only ever used as an epistemic modal. So in terms of our background theory, it can only ever be paired with an epistemic modal base. Similarly, this modal particle ka only ever gets a deontic modal base, and the particle kesh only gets a circumstantial modal base. So unlike modal auxiliaries in English, these modal particles in Lillooet more or less have a fixed type of modal base. However, their modal strength seems to be more fluid and to be variable with the context. So that is, depending upon the context, these elements can be translatable either as weak or strong modals. So in an example like the first one here, that epistemic particle ka can only be understood as a weak existential modal, because if it were a strong universal modal, this sentence would be contradictory. It would be akin to, the woman must have died and she must have moved somewhere. But in the second sentence, the particle seems to function as a strong necessity modal, because as the authors report, the context is one in which the speaker is intending to express that the proposition follows from their information. And in fact, translation is a weak epistemic modal in English would be rather infelicitous here. So again, to summarize, in these languages like Lillooet, it looks like the modals have a fixed type of modal base, and the quantificational force varies with the context. If this is descriptively accurate, it raises the question of how is this possible, right? Against our background theory of modals, how could something like the strength of the modal be determined by the context? Well, there's two kinds of analyses that have emerged. The first is the one that follows from the original Ruhlman et al. 2008 work. More recently, however, Deal 2011 follows a rather different original line of analysis. For my purposes here, I just want to sketch out the Ruhlman et al. Analysis. And the idea is that, contrary to first appearances, the quantificational force of the modal in Lillooet actually is fixed in the lexicon, and it's always universal. Okay? However, in the lexical entry to the modal base is argument to this function f that takes the modal base and returns some subset of it, and it's this function f that varies with the context. In a context where that function f returns the entire modal base, you get a proposition that's equivalent to a strong modal statement in English. But in a context where f returns some subset of the modal base, you get a proposition that's weaker and could be essentially pragmatically equivalent to a weak modal statement in a language like English. For reasons of time, I'll refer you to the Ruhlman et al. Paper for more on this analysis, but I think I've shown enough, okay, to spell out the consequences that it raises for our classic theory of English modals. Namely, when you see the Lillooet system, of course, you have to wonder, could English at all be analyzed in terms closer to this modal system? And the way that Ruhlman and Alia propose that we do this is rather interesting. And it's the notion that English modals actually have an identical semantics, pretty much, to Lillooet modals overall. But English has this particular class of modals, the strong modals, where there's a presupposition added that that function f, contributed by the context, returns the entire modal base. Whether or not this is right, Ruhlman and Alia spend some time discussing this possibility. It provides us another case where the analysis of an understudied language raises new analyses of long-studied phenomena in well-studied languages like English. So to wrap up, I just want to make a reiteration of the main points of the presentation. So again, in the past 15 years, we've seen dramatic increase in studies of understudied and endangered languages informed by formal semantic theory. Secondly, this work has revealed areas of semantic variation that were completely unanticipated just 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. On the other hand, this work has revealed areas of semantic uniformity that were also unanticipated. I haven't had time to discuss those here today, but I'd be happy to say some words about them if you're interested. In this context, too, it should be noted that that variation which we have found could not have been observed without the benefit of a background theory of semantics. So I think it's clear that it's only against our background theory of modal semantics that the actual unique properties of Lillooet modals and their deeper significance for our theory of English modals become clear. And similarly, Anand's analysis of indexical shift makes critical use of diagonalization operators, which is a formal device that was originally introduced in a completely different kind of context. There's a tangential point I'd like to make here too very quickly, which is that you'll notice that in both these cases, indexical shift and these modals with variable strength, the point of variation with a language like English seems to lie in the lexicon in terms of the lexical inventory of the language, which was a notion that was discussed in the principles and parameters session yesterday. Finally, though this might be somewhat banal, it's worth remembering that investigation of understudied and endangered languages doesn't only inform our theory of cross-linguistic variation, but it also affects our analyses of widely studied languages. And here I'd like to, again, make a quick kind of tangential point, which is that when we ask the question, or when the question is asked, what is the value of studying lots and lots of languages, we often reach for the answer that, it in some way helps us to decide between competing analyses. So, Professor Kane yesterday in the P&P session mentioned this notion of, studying lots of languages puts limits on our imagination. And that does happen, but I think it happens less often than something that's actually the exact opposite, which is that study of a phenomenon in some languages, study of phenomena in understudied languages actually introduces new analyses or solutions for old problems. Ones that would have never been imagined without the benefit of seeing that phenomenon through the lens of that language. And so in that sense, study of understudied languages and exotic phenomena actually expands our domain of hypotheses rather than necessarily shrinks them. Okay, thank you.
Is it working? No. No. It's not working? No. Well, I'll shout.
Yeah, we can
it's working. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Actually, in the spirit of last remark, I have a question for Jessica. This very interesting pattern that you described with the subject that gets trapped when with the high absolutive case. It wasn't. This is just a clarification question. It wasn't entirely clear to me how that consequence follows from phase theory. What kind of phase theoretic assumption gives you that result? Given that under standard views on phase theory, the subject could already be at the phase edge, so that movement of the object would not necessarily interact with its further movement. And then a related question, again on the relations between the study of these exotic languages and widely studied languages. Don't you think that this pattern is close enough to familiar asymmetries, familiar subject-object asymmetries in certain environments, in languages like English, for instance, right? If you take cases of environments like WH Island environments, for instance, you see something that looks to me quite similar. The subject cannot extract, the object more easily extract. Don't you think that there could be a generalization there that could be captured, and would phase theory, a phase theoretic approach, offer a device to deal with a generalization if there is one?
Yeah, these are both good questions. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So with respect to the first question, what's crucial for us is that the little v, the phasal head is generated above the subject, and that's how we're able to derive that. So these status suffixes, exactly what they are, our proposal is whatever they are, they're generated up there, and that is what's trapping the subject. So that's important for us, and whether we find reflexes of this in other languages like English, I don't know. But yeah, you're right. We need the assumption that these are high, and that's how the subject gets trapped. With respect to connecting this to other subject-object asymmetries, I mean, one thing that's important here is that we find this only with transitive subjects, that these are the only ones getting trapped. And I think what, for us, makes this look very different from a language like English were the predictions, for example, that we made in the end. So ergative subjects actually can extract, but they can only do it in environments where objects lack case. And so, and this is found, I think, across the family. So you can, as far as I know, in all of the high absolutive languages, when you have a reflexive object, and reflexives behave interestingly in that they're, very stuck to the verb phrase. You can't front them. It seems like they are small in some way. So for us, this gives us a clue that it seems to be something about the object and not really about the position of the subject. Yeah.
With respect to what Seth Cable said at the end, I don't think there's any conflict between the two ways of proceeding, and I don't think it's very easy to say which happens more often than the other. With respect to modals themselves, maybe you didn't intend this, but there seemed to be an assumption that within the set of languages covered by the term Standard Average European, modals all act the same. I doubt that that's true, although I couldn't make a demonstration right now. But I think that if you look, for example, at the difference between should and must in English and try to map it to other European languages, it wouldn't be a simple mapping. A more general question is that it's very striking that in the set of understudied and endangered languages, no European languages were mentioned. And more generally, that there's no mention of any such language that's close to other languages. So no North Italian dialect was mentioned, although many are both understudied and endangered. And similarly, no dialect of Chinese is mentioned. I think there's an assumption here that it would be interesting to try to make explicit. And that assumption is that if a language is close to other well-studied languages, it's of theoretically less interest to study it than to study languages that are further from better studied languages in some notion of distance. I think it would be interesting to try to show that that's true or not true or undecidable.
No, I was playing to stereotype in setting up this talk. So the original version of the slides actually mentioned work on, say, Mandarin. And I think this version also mentions work on Finnish, for example, that was done by the cartoonists. And in doing that, I think I removed Mandarin simply because I wanted to play to the stereotype that, Mandarin shouldn't be considered an understudied language, or, maybe the, other Chinese dialects. But I do not hold to that stereotype. It was simply in this selection, I wanted to choose languages that best fit the stereotype of an understudied language in terms of being, not European and, tending not to be spoken by academic linguists. But yeah, the study of minority dialects is incredibly critical to the overall enterprise. And yeah, I fully agree to that. It's a pernicious stereotype.
I'm Laurie Levin from Carnegie Mellon University. So I have a more general question. It's been proposed that what is needed because of the fast extinction of languages is collection of unanalyzed data. But as we can tell from a lot of the talks that have been given here this morning and yesterday, so the question is, what will you have when the language dies? Will you have an analysis of extraction asymmetries, or will you have an unanalyzed corpus? And I think we can see that neither one is ideal. If you have the answers to your questions on whatever they are, you might not have answers to any other questions. But if you have a corpus, you may not be able to answer certain theoretical questions from the corpus. And there was a recent article in the Association for Computational Linguistics that was co-authored by an alumnus from this department, who I don't think is here. And in that article, he, along with his co-author, said that the future generations will forgive us for leaving aside our theoretical questions for 20 years, but they won't forgive us for letting these languages go with nothing remaining, with nothing to show for it. There are a lot of languages for which all that exists is a few pages of field notes. And so that's the question. What is worse, to forego the theoretical questions for 20 years, or to end up with a corpus and possibly not have answers to the theoretical questions?
So I haven't spoken yet, and so my co-speakers are looking at me meaningfully. So I think obviously both of the mistakes that you outlined would be mistakes. So it would be a mistake to forego theory for 20 years, and it would be a mistake not to just collect some stuff that goes beyond what your theory. I have some experience working with an unanalyzed corpus. So Jessica mentioned the Wampanoag Revival Project, which is something that's been going on in this department for a while now. The Wampanoag are the people who live on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. They're the people who taught the Pilgrims how to survive when they arrived. Terrible tactical mistake. They should have thrown rocks, it turned out. They still get grief about this from other indigenous groups. And their language has been dead for about a century, but they would like to learn to speak it again. And the main text that we have is a complete Bible translation that was published here in Boston. The first Bible published in this hemisphere was a Wampanoag Bible. So I've been reading the Bible very slowly and carefully, unanalyzed corpus, trying to figure out how Wampanoag is put together. And the Bible is wonderful in many ways. There's lots of good linguistic stuff in there, but it's surprisingly bad on various things. There are no multiple WH questions in the Bible, for example. Jesus never turns to the disciples and asks who bought what. It's surprisingly bad on kinship terminology. So there are lots of genealogies in the Bible, but they're all step by step. It's all X begat Y and Y begat Z. So there are no, I think there are no aunts in the Bible, and there are only paternal uncles. So there are various real big gaps. So, collecting an unanalyzed corpus, there are all kinds of things you can learn by serendipity, but there are all kinds of things that are not in there, unsurprisingly. And there are no stars. That's the other classic problem with corpus. Yeah, there's no ungrammatical judgments.
Thank you very much for these inspiring talks. And so I want to ask a very basic question about the title of the session, which is about endangered languages. And one thing in common that you see across these is that none of them, virtually none of them, is used in the schools for instruction. So as linguists, and here I have a vested interest in asking this question, as linguists, what can we do actually to change that picture? Because as long as we don't use these languages in schools in Guatemala or in Australia, they're going to not survive. So what does our work can contribute to this issue of?
And I mean, the sort of flip side of that is that the languages that have come, languages that were formerly endangered, that have come to be used in schools, languages like Hawaiian and Mi'kmaq, those are languages that are enjoying a renaissance and are much more successful. Those are things that came about because of the passionate advocacy of native speakers from those communities. Linguists have some kind of role to play in that advocacy, but it's, I think it would be impossible for us to bring those kinds of situations about except by facilitating them. I don't know what my co-speakers think, but that's what I think.
Yeah, so actually in the Mayan family, we do see some of these languages taught in schools, and I think the role of native speaker linguists here has been really crucial. So especially in Guatemala, after the Guatemalan Civil War, things were extremely bad for indigenous Mayas in Guatemala. But many people coming out of these language programs that were created afterwards, some of them, of course, went on to MA or PhD programs there or in the US, but many of them are in Guatemala now, and they're developing, for example, pedagogical material for schools and working on language policy. And so I think this is a really great thing that comes out of having a core group of native speaker linguists, is you get people not just working in the theoretical domain, but also working on political and educational issues in language. So, and that's very good.
How good that
is.
Yes.
Okay. I would like us to recognize another MIT alumnus in this context of understudied languages and their importance for linguistic theoretical studies. Unfortunately, not alive anymore, otherwise I'm sure he would have been here, and that's Robert Lees, whose name has been mentioned a couple of times yesterday, I think, in the context of English nominalizations, but he also did very important work for Turkish linguistics, a little Turkic, but mostly standard Turkish. And at the time, he, I guess, was first generation MIT linguistics, and at the time, Turkish was, in fact, a very understudied language in the context of generative linguistics. And I believe that his is the first generative phonological study of standard Turkish. As you probably know, there is this important monograph by him. And where he didn't just reanalyze traditional insights, but in fact made many new observations, interestingly for a non-native linguist, but he used to, his philosophy was almost verbatim the same as Jessica telling us about Ken Hale. And that in itself might not be a coincidence, because he apparently was Ken Hale's mentor at the University of Illinois when Ken was an assistant professor there. And in fact, Ken himself learned some of his Turkish, which you might or might not know was quite good, from Lees and from the Turkish students surrounding Lees, the students whom Ken himself mentored, it seems. And in fact, I myself am perhaps a good example of the result of this philosophy, because I got roped into the generative enterprise by Lees. And so I just wanted to mention this and to recognize Lees for his importance in this particular context. And in fact, his nominalization book himself, even though it is mainly about English nominalizations, has two appendices. One about German nominalizations, and the other, not a terribly understudied language, but still, and Turkish nominalizations. And certainly that particular appendix has given rise to some work more in depth later on. So I wanted to mention that as well. And if I could perhaps also ask Norvin in particular a question having nothing to do with this more general point about another philosophical point that he made, namely sometimes in a derivation when a particular element doesn't get its wishes fulfilled, that the derivation can still go on its way the way it is. But certainly there are these other instances, at least one of whose examples you showed us, namely where the derivation crashes, where it commits suicide, let's say, the element not getting its wishes or perhaps needs met. So is there a way of ahead of time knowing what kind of situation we will be in? Is it a difference between an element's wishes versus needs? Is that a way of looking at it? Or is there a more fruitful way of looking at it?
So actually this gets to Seth's point about different modal bases, I think, yeah. No, I don't think there's an a priori way to know which kinds of needs are fatal if not met and which kinds of needs you just should try to satisfy. It's an ongoing research problem.
We have time for one more question. 10 seconds.
Hi, this is for Jessica, I think, but generally, Ken's influence, maybe through Lee's, in any case, on the idea that we need the participation of native speaker linguists is something that informs a project that I'm working on now, which is a way of answering Laurie's question. We work with native speaker linguists all over Africa, and Africa has this, excuse me, Africa has this property of having lots of minority languages, but the people who speak those minority languages still have access to the academic system. And they come up through it being trained as academics, and they don't give up their native languages, or in many cases don't devalue them. And so as a result, there are lots of native speaker African linguists speaking languages of which we know very little and could know so much more because these people are trained. They can do glosses and very informed and sometimes theoretically very interesting work. And the model that we developed with our project was designed to take advantage of native speaker knowledge by designing these questionnaires which are based on theoretically informed questions, eliciting very rich data sets, and then trying to get them across lots of different speakers from the different families so that we have great comparative work and very detailed. It's hard to do, it takes a long time, but it answers the kinds of questions that Laurie was raising, is that on the one hand, we don't stop doing our theoretical work, we design the questionnaires with a particular theoretical questions, maybe a little broader than we might normally do. But the idea is to get a lot of data that's not just data that supports a particular point of view that I might have, but we want people to be able to use the data that we've collected to refute us. I mean, that would be the best compliment in the way we think about things. Now, the African School is developing even more people who will, we hope, collaborate with us. Your model, and what you described is going on in the Mayan family, sounds like another great opportunity for this mode of research. And the way that it's working now is that we have a rich database of all these sentences that are collected from different questionnaires. And so each project has its own search engine, but the engine works in the same database. So every project that contributes to our contributes to the general wealth that we know about any one of the particular languages. So I think that kind of model could work just great with the kind of situation that you're describing, and if you like, we can talk about it later.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And yeah, I'm sorry for omitting you from that last slide. Clearly, this should also have been discussed there. And I'd love to talk about it more later. I'll use this as an opportunity to plug the second family that we are trying to put together, the second formal approaches to Mayan Linguistics conference, where the current plan is to try to bring together people who are doing corpus work on Mayan languages. And this sort of addresses the earlier question of, so the best case scenario is not to have unanalyzed corpuses or just analyzing data, but to have analyzed corpuses or analyzable corpuses. And so the plan for the second workshop is to bring together people who work with corpora in different respects. So people who work on documentation, but people who also do theoretical work to try and figure out how we can sort of standardize a format for making this data accessible to a wide range of people who could use it both for theoretical and for educational or documentation purposes. So what you're doing there sounds like it would be really informative to us. So I'll talk to you about that later. Thank you.
All right, let's thank our